many of them use their own husbands as donors. That was one of the more heartbreaking, especially for like Julie. Her father believed that he was her biological father because they used his sample, him and his wife, to create a child. Come to find out that this doctor, I guess, discarded his sample in order to use his own, which is just it's disgusting. My God. And so they go into this whole tangent about what quiverful is. And evidently, it's an entire cult. The Bible verse says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. And it says, if a man with his wife has a lot of children, he will send them out as arrows. He's like a warrior for God, and he sends his children out as arrows into the world who will be ambassadors for God. The children are raised to actively participate in government, to actively run for office, to seek positions of political prominence, and eventually that the civil law will actually be the Bible. And as you can probably imagine, white supremacy is all up and through there. It says Jacoba and a lot of the individuals touched by this were very emotional, and had a feeling that what I was there to do wasn't to apply the law to determine whether or not Dr. Klein had committed a crime. They thought I was there to deliver catharsis, and I wasn't. They're legally not linking it with the definition of, but it is a form of, I think that most women would agree that this is a form of.
Why is it playing my face right now?
do that. Cool. Perfect. All right. Testing, testing. I think that's pretty good. All right. What's good, y'all? My name is Morgan Clement. I'm an artist and designer based in Los Angeles, California. I have a clothing line called Matin and Morgan. And this is Good Morning Morgan. And before I get started, today I am drinking Portrait coffee. Still drinking Portrait. Still waiting for everybody's busy to come in. And yeah. What else is there? Last week I did my first late takes, and it was discussing Everything Sucks on Netflix, one season show that I really loved, but that got obviously canceled. And this upcoming week, what I announced last week, this upcoming week for late takes, I'm going to be doing Betty, but also talking about Rachel Vinberg and her speaking out about sexual, I believe it's sexual harassment. It might be sexual assault allegations against the director Cary Fukunaga. So that's going to be this upcoming Friday. Look out for that. But today I wanted to discuss Netflix's new documentary called Our Father, which they have been teasing for a while now. And essentially what the premise is there's a fertility doctor, like an OBGYN, I guess, or whatever, and he has been using his own DNA in order to impregnate a ton of the women that came in to see him. And so all of these people are now adults, and they're finding out that back in the 70s and 80s, their mothers were impregnated through IVF using this man's DNA without her knowledge. This is kind of like a touchy subject because it discusses things that I would argue are not appropriate for YouTube. I don't know what I still don't know YouTube's policy on actually discussing sexual assault and those kinds of things. So I'm gonna say all of the terms outright, and then in post I'm probably gonna edit over all of them, because I'd have to imagine that YouTube has some sort of rule around this, but it is something that probably needs to be, it does need to be discussed. So yeah, Netflix has been teasing this documentary for the past couple weeks or so. This is not something that's far outside of the realm of it's not something that's surprising to me, right? I feel like this is maybe the first time that I've heard an actual story of it happening, but this doesn't seem outside of the realm of possibility by any stretch of the imagination. And I actually remember this being a premise of one of the episodes, and I don't know for a fact which show it was. I believe it was Gotham. I don't remember which show specifically it was, but there was a show I remember watching some years ago where this was the premise, that there was a doctor who, in the show that I was watching, it was a little bit different. They were kidnapping women, putting them into a comatose state, and then using them as I guess incubators to give birth to children. And there was this one doctor that was the father of all of these children. So that was a premise of, I believe it was Gotham, but I don't know for a fact. And so I've heard of this premise before. It's not surprising to me that it actually happens. But to hear it actually in documentary, in a documentary setting, is just wild. So when I saw that it was finally released, I immediately started watching it last night. And it actually got much worse than I thought. It actually got much worse than y'all, it got so much worse than I actually thought it was gonna be. And it's already starting off bad because it's teetering on the precipice of, I mean, it is sexual assault, right? So it starts off with the way that they advertised it was that they had like a ticker that was showing like the number of, it said siblings, and then it had the number of siblings like rolling up and up and up and up and up, because there's all these people kept finding out that they were related to each other because this man snuck and put his own DNA into all of these different women. And so it started off with one. Her name is Jacoba, and her parents were pretty much outright with her, like, hey, we had some issues conceiving. The parents went to, I guess, to a fertility doctor to find out that the husband, her father, was infertile or had like a low sperm count or something along those lines. And so they decided to go ahead and go with a donor. Back in this is the late 70s, early 80s. Back in the late 70s, there was a doctor named Dr. Donald Klein, who evidently was like one of the foremost physicians within the field of like fertility and those kinds of things. And so, unlike now for like IVF, it seemed like you almost exclusively had to, if you weren't dealing with him directly, you were dealing at least with one of his colleagues. And he was based in Indiana. Yeah, in Indiana. And so, prominent IVF doctor. A lot of women came to see him because he had a very high success rate or something along those lines. And so Jacoba's mother went to go and see this doctor. They, I believe, went through the trouble of picking out a sperm donor for them. And so Jacoba was well aware of the fact that she was the result of a sperm donor. She was an only child, and so she had interest in finding out if she had any siblings anywhere. And so this is right around the time that all of these DNA testing, I believe it's like 2014-ish or somewhere like about 6, 7, 8 years ago, is when all these like DNA testing companies started to really get their footing and that kind of stuff. And so she took a DNA test with 23andMe and was hoping to find results that she had 1 or 2 siblings. So the rule supposedly was that whenever somebody donates sperm, their donation or their DNA is only used 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 times to avoid having a situation where a whole bunch of people within a small geographic area have the same father and thus the same DNA. And so the rule was 3. So she was expecting, I'm one of 3. So if I look on here, I should have maybe 2 half siblings at most. When she signed in and put all of her DNA, or had her DNA evidence come back, she found out that she had 7 siblings that were already registered. And so that was a red flag immediately. Like, why were y'all using this guy's sample so much, right? Like, that goes against the rules. She ended up starting like a group chat, I believe, with all of her half siblings, and they ended up reaching out to she mentioned that they were talking amongst themselves to try and figure out other family members, any knowledge that they had of their family and all this other kind of stuff. And so they ended up reaching out to a woman named Sylvia, who ended up being Dr. Klein's cousin or something like that, I think. Like they kind of jokingly said, like, well, what if it's the doctor? Like, what if the doctor is actually our father? Like, jokingly at first. But then they kind of put that thought aside and kept it pushing, and come to find out that they found out through this connection, through this cousin Sylvia, that she's actually related to Dr. Klein, and thus Dr. Klein is actually their father. And so Jacoba said, I don't know what you do in this situation. Like, when you complain about a doctor, like, what do you do? Like, what are you supposed to do? And so she complains to the Attorney General's office in Indiana, and they don't get back to her. And so she doesn't really have any other recourse. She starts reaching out to like reporters, news reporters, to pick up the story so that it can be publicized. And none of them pay attention until she gets to Angela Ganote, who is a reporter for Fox 59, which is an Indiana news station, I believe. And she picks up the story and starts investigating and pushing. She starts calling Dr. Klein directly, which bold, right? I could never be an investigative journalist because making those phone calls. They start pressing Dr. Klein and he starts to get a little bit defensive, right? So he's well aware of how many kids, well, I don't even know that he's aware of how many kids he's fathered, but he knows what he's been doing, right? So he's got kids with his wife and he sends his kids out to meet with, or wait, no, let's see. Jacoba reached out to his two kids through Facebook. She makes all of these connections with all these people through Facebook. And so she reaches out to his two kids, Doug and Doug and Donna, in order to discuss the fact that they have the same father, like what's going on, that kind of a thing. So they meet at her church. She meets her half siblings, his two kids, for the first time. And they say that he admitted that yes, this is something that he did. Initially, he was lying and saying, "No, I'm not the father of these kids." He even said that to the reporter, like, "No, I'm not submitting a DNA sample. I'm not the father of these kids." That kind of a thing. They come, his two kids, and admit that he is the father. That he did use his own samples to father all of these kids, but there was no more than 10. That was their insistence, that there was no more than 10. Right. The way that this documentary is set up is they use that same like number ticker thing. So they said there's no more than 10, cutscene, and then it says sibling number 14. So bold-faced lie, right? So Julie is number 14. And when it gets to this point where they've met 14 of their siblings, or they see that there's 14 people, they call a meeting with Dr. Klein. Dr. Klein agrees to meet with all of the ones who are aware all of a sudden. And so he walks in, he's got a cane, and they notice that he's got like a gun in his waistband. And I guess he's like trying to seem threatening or whatever. I guess trying to insinuate without saying in plain language that like if you talk, there's gonna be problems, kind of a thing. Which, what? And so he, I guess, he ended up asking, what their names were, what they did for a living, how old they were, those kinds of things, and was like making notes on all of the kids that he had fathered. And Jacobin said, like, it felt like he was ranking us. Like he wanted to know which one of us had been the most successful or had done the best or whatever. That kind of a thing. And then started passing out Bible verses, particularly Jeremiah 1:5, which says, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. And that's when Jacoba and Julie were both like, he knew exactly what he was doing when he was doing all of this. Like, why are you using Bible verses to justify what you were doing to these women? So then they've gotten to 17 siblings now. Matt White is the 17th sibling that they found thus far. And so his mother's name is Liz. And Liz she wanted a kid. I don't believe that she had a husband or a partner or anybody. She just wanted to have a kid. But she struggled with infertility herself. And so that's why she was visiting a fertility clinic. That's why she employed Dr. Klein. And she went there multiple times, had multiple treatments in order to try and have a baby. And she finally had Matt. And she said that she described the clinic when she went to go to get these treatments, that there was literally no one else there. So they pulled like a nurse that worked for him. And they were discussing how like he would, like they're trying to figure out how he would have maneuvered this, right? Because he would have had to have done this. This is before, this is fairly early in the IVF journey, I guess, or history. And so literally, if you're providing a sample, it has to be fairly fresh, right? So they're trying to piece together like, okay, so the nurse is like, well, usually we would use if we couldn't find like an actual donor, that we would use, they were across the street from a hospital and they would use some of the doctors, some of the residents as donors there with prior knowledge from these patients, but they would use doctors across the street, right? So she would go across the street to get samples from these doctors. And then she said she would walk the samples back across the street. They had to be at body temperature. And so she would put them in her cleavage or like in her bra or whatever to keep them warm, which I thought was a little odd. But I mean, it worked. Evidently, it kept the sperm alive. So, but yeah, so evidently she would be bringing these samples back and he would, I guess, be chucking them in the trash. Like, I don't know what he was doing with them. He would disappear into his office and come back with his own sample, which is absolutely, I mean, oh my God, it's disgusting. For Matt White, number 17, with his mom, Liz, who has been struggling with fertility, when she heard the news, she said, quote, I was 15 times and didn't even know it. Which the subtext there is that she went to this doctor, Dr. Klein, 15 times to have these treatments done, to have IVF treatments done. And it didn't take, I guess, 14 out of the 15 times. And then on the 15th time, that's when she got her son Matt, which is just terrible. I mean, it's just creepy and gross and disgusting. And I just, let's see. So then after they've gotten to 17 siblings, they found out that there's 17. He keeps insisting, he keeps changing the number. He said initially that there weren't more than 10, and he said there's definitely not more than 15. Now we're at 17, and he's starting to threaten Jacoba. He's starting to threaten all of the ones who are talking. So Jacoba said that she went outside one day and all of the like bolts that were holding her tires on were removed. Julie was keeping a running document in Google Drive, I believe, or Google Docs, excuse me. She was keeping a running document in Google Docs as they were investigating this whole thing and keeping track of all the siblings and all that kind of stuff. And she had all of this record of emails, and she logged in one day and all of it was removed. Now, I don't know how he pulled that one off, because this is an old man, right? Which means he has some sort of connection, right? I don't know if it was maybe his kids or if he like paid somebody to hack into her accounts, but it's wild. Excuse me. It's wild the links that he went to try and silence them. A lot of it was like threatening, like not overtly threatening people with a gun, but he's evidently was running around with a gun in his waistband this entire time. To seem threatening to these people. They've gotten to sibling 22, sibling 33. And now they're starting to be concerned because like the reason why they only use a donor 3 times again is because you don't want too many people with the same genetic makeup within the same geographic area. And so now they're starting to get into a place where they know each other. So like, Lisa was sibling 33 and her husband coached Julie's daughter in softball. So it's like they know each other. They're all concerned, like, have I accidentally like dated somebody that's my brother or sister? Have I accidentally like, I don't know, like you never know who throughout the town. They said that they were even just walking throughout the town or like moving throughout the city. They're always like looking at other people like, is that a Klein boy? Is that a Klein girl? Like, one of the huge indicators that they had that they were something off is many of them said that they come from families that have very dark hair, very dark eyes, and that they were all blonde hair and blue eyed, or the majority of them had blonde hair and blue eyes. And that they always felt out of place because they didn't look like their families. And so some of them for the majority of them, their parents didn't actually tell them anything about fertility treatments or anything like that. And so they just assumed that many of them used their own husbands as donors. That was one of the more heartbreaking, especially for like Julie. Um, her father believed that he was her biological father because they used his sample, him and his wife, to create a child. Come to find out that this doctor, I guess, discarded his sample in order to use his own, which is just it's disgusting. My God. So there were many of them. Like, there were, unlike Jacoba was kind of like a rare instance where it's like, well, yes, you are from a donor, we had some fertility issues. Boom. For many of them, it was like, well, we maybe had some fertility issues, but we just used a doctor to facilitate insemination, right? Like, we're not here to look for a donor. I'm using my husband right here, right? For many of them, they didn't even know because they were like, well, my husband is the one who impregnated me. I mean, we used the doctor to facilitate it, but like, come to find out that the doctor's been throwing out all these husbands' samples in order to use his own. And so Julie's father said, when he found out, this doctor has taken everything away from me, and was just heartbroken to find out that his daughter was not his own. Which, can you imagine? Like, can you imagine? Can you imagine somebody swapping out a sample so that your child is not yours? This child that you've raised, like, these aren't young kids either. These are grown adults who have their own children at this point. Just crazy. So let's see. They said that they had to start having conversations with their own kids. Like I said, they're grown and they're old enough to have their own children now. And now they have to start having conversations with their own kids. Like, make sure that you don't date so-and-so's son because that's your cousin, or you can't date this person over here because that's your cousin, or, you know what I'm saying? All of these kids are now going to school together because they still live in the same city. They live within like the same, I think, like a 20-mile radius of each other. You go to the same schools and things like that. And so Klein finally agrees to do a meeting with Angela, the reporter from Fox 59. And she goes to meet with him at a restaurant that's near her news station. Again, mentioning that he showed up with a firearm in his waist belt, or his waistband. And even asked her, like, is it okay to have firearms in the restaurant, which he took as a threat. And he even told her, like, I know where you live, like threatening the reporter to not. They already ran a story, but because he didn't provide a DNA sample to confirm that he was the father, and did not agree to be part of the story, they couldn't use his name. But they now had enough evidence to use his name without even his permission at this point. And so he had taken it to the point of even threatening the reporter, bringing a gun to the restaurant where they met, saying, I know where you live, those kinds of things. Really weird. It's a weird dude. They use this weird story. So evidently Dr. Klein, way back in 1963, they told this story about Dr. Klein hitting a little girl. Like, a little girl was riding her bike, and darted out between two cars, and Dr. Klein accidentally hit her with his car, and she ended up dying. She was 4 years old. And some people were speculating as to whether or not this had something to do with why he was doing what he was doing. No, right? Like, I mean, maybe I don't doubt that running down a little girl with your car would change your life. If they said that it made him more religious, that he was a devout Christian, supposedly. Obviously, he's throwing around Bible verses, but I don't know. People were kind of grasping at straws, trying to figure out. Like, if it felt like an elephant in the room type situation, like trying to figure out why he would do something like this. Personally, I believe that, and I feel like this is relevant because we're living in this moment where Women's reproductive rights are kind of under attack. So I feel like this is very relevant. There is a specific kind of guy out there that there are men out there who get off on the idea of having impregnated a woman against her will. Not necessarily going full out with assault per se, but there are men who have some weird kink around impregnating women against their will and then having nothing to do with the kid whatsoever. Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, not only that, but like, I feel like there are men who have ego around knowing that they have a ton of kids out there. Like, they don't know where they are, they don't know their names, they don't know what they look like, but just knowing in your mind that you just have a ton of kids out there. There are some men that pride themselves on that. I think that that's the reason why this was not surprising to me. Is this seems like an opportunity for a man to get off in that way. Even if this story had not come forward, like even if this had not become a thing, a documentary or whatever, even if Dr. Klein had never been outed as doing this, if you told me that there was a doctor doing this somewhere, a male doctor doing this somewhere, I would believe it. It does not seem far outside of the realm of possibility to me. This is such a vulnerable, you're trusting a third party to inseminate you. I mean, you're trusting a third party to impregnate you, which leaves you really vulnerable for all kinds of crazy things, right? Which actually kind of terrifies me, because as somebody who will never conceive of children without the aid of some kind of like IVF or anything like that. It's concerning to me that this is even kind of like a thing, but I'm not surprised that it's a thing though. So Jacoba kind of was like spearheading the investigation here. She was kind of like, I don't know. She was the one who was making all of these calls to all of the siblings as they, I mean, it sounds like they were getting notifications on a regular basis. Like she was watching 23andMe and Ancestry.com and things like that, like on a day-to-day basis. All of these people were slowly trickling in, and they would get their results and almost immediately get a call or a message from Jacoba saying, hey, we're siblings. Hey, we're part of this Klein investigation. Because by this point, it's aired on TV, right, on local news. There were a few of them who actually found out through that local news report. So Jacoba was like evidently like sitting by the computer on a day-to-day basis, watching it almost like it's like Facebook or Twitter or something like that, like watching it like it's the news for alerts coming in saying that she's got a new half sibling, that they have new half siblings. And she was the one who took it upon herself to reach out to all of these people, which props to her, because I would not have been able to do that. She reached out to these people, let them know that, hey, we're part of this weird Dr. Klein situation. This weird doctor is your father. Like a lot of the people by this point, people may have seen the news. There were some people who had seen the newscast, but it didn't register to them because their parents had not told them that they had any issues with fertility or anything like that they had ever gone to a fertility doctor, did not have that discussion with them at all. So a lot of these people saw this news story, didn't think twice of it, said maybe, that's unfortunate for these people, and then kept it pushing. And then just because by chance they happened to use a 23andMe DNA kit or whatever, they just happened to find out through their database that they are part of this scandal, that they are one of the numerous Klein kids. That he just kept over and over and over again, replacing sperm donors with his own samples over and over and over and over again. So there were some people there was one woman who was shaking when she was recounting finding this out. Earth-shattering information. I mean, it was just insane. So One thing that Jacoba came across, because evidently, like with every single person that she interacted with throughout trying to get a resolution out of this case, because she rightfully so was incensed, um, and wanted justice and wanted some kind of charges pressed. So she kept pressing the attorney general, and anytime that somebody corresponded with her, she would look them up on Facebook. And so she looks these people up on Facebook. She looks for any information she can find, anybody that's connected to Dr. Klein, those kinds of things. And one of the people that she gets an email from had the email address on their Facebook page with it said quiverful.com or .org or something along those lines. And so they go into this whole tangent about what quiverful is. And evidently it's an entire cult based on like one Bible verse that says, the Bible verse says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. That is Psalm 127:4, and that's the New King James Version. And then they show all of these interviews of people who evidently subscribe to this ideology. Jacoba describes it as quiverful is essentially a cult aimed at having as many children as possible. And they cut to this woman who's describing what it is. And it says, if a man with his wife has a lot of children, he will send them out as arrows. He's like a warrior for God. And he sends his children out as arrows into the world who will be ambassadors for God. The children are raised to actively participate in government, to actively run for office, to seek positions of political prominence, and eventually that the civil law will actually be the Bible. And as you can probably imagine, white supremacy is all up and through there. So this was initially an ideology meant to produce more white babies, I guess. Produce as many white babies as possible. So we've got all of these kids who are blonde haired and blue eyed. And Jacoba actually says, I hate to say this, but it's almost like we're like this perfect Aryan clan, and it's disgusting. So they were even kind of part of some weird agenda. They don't know for a fact that this is an ideology that Dr. Klein subscribes to. They don't know that this is actually part of his faith per se. This is all speculation, but they were confronted with the possibility that they might be the result of some weird fixation with bolstering numbers within the white race within America. And honestly, as an aside, because I was sitting there and I was like, there's a few different things that are subtext here, kind of obvious, but they were kind of tap dancing around it, trying to avoid some of these things, because obviously it's all of it's terrible, but how terrible is it, right? Like I said, I believe that there are men who will force their way into positions like this just to be able to, like I said, I feel like there are men who get off on the idea of impregnating a woman against her will. They get off on the idea of having a bunch of kids that they don't know, they just knowing that they're out there. And so I believe that that's a thing, but I also am not surprised. I would not be surprised if this had something to do with white supremacy and racism, that kind of thing. Again, I think that we live in a very specific period of time where we need to be concerned about things like this, right? They talk about it in general terms. They say like, hey, there's a decline in birth rates here in the United States. There's a decline in birth rates throughout all of the first world countries. We're not unique in that, but when people are advocating for an increase in birth rates, when they're trying to force people to have children, when they're trying to remove any barriers or any prevention strategies that there might be to not having kids, we have to assume in the back, or we have to keep in the back of our minds that this is likely because it's not that they want more black babies, it's not that they want more brown babies. They want more white babies. That's really what they want. When they're talking about a decrease in birth rates, like I said, I've mentioned this before. I think that this is common knowledge at this point because people are harping on it because it's terrible. But the birth rates within the black community, infant mortality and maternal mortality during or shortly after childbirth is insanely high. If that was something that was of the utmost importance to the American government or populace in general, it's something that would have been dealt with a long time ago. That's just medical negligence. That's not even, you know what I'm saying? That has nothing to do with necessarily fertility. I mean, you've made it all the way through the 9 months, right? Usually it is medical malpractice or negligence. And so if they really cared about having as many babies born in general as possible, seems that would be a great place to start, is a lot of these unnecessary deaths that take place. But the reality of the situation is that they don't care about the black babies, right? They don't care about the brown babies. They're concerned that there's a decrease. Like, they've been talking about for years now how by 2050 is when they believe that the majority of people within this country, I believe specifically the United States, are going to be brown, is what they're saying. Because I mean, if we're looking at the global population, the majority of people, period, are brown. China has a huge population, but India has a huge population as well, and then the entire population of Africa is huge. So oftentimes when we are told that we are minorities, or, you know what I'm saying, it's relative. Here within the United States, they are terrified of the browning of America. And so that would be bad enough if there weren't contributing factors to a decrease in birth rates in general. Like I said, all first world countries are going through a decrease in birth rates. And this is mostly because of like inequality. A lot of people are kind of giving up hope because of like climate change is kind of a thing. Like, if you're not going to do anything about climate change, why should I bring a child into the world? That kind of a thing. They're going to have to deal with all of the wildfires and the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the water shortage and those kinds of things. Like, why would I do that? I just think that we're in an interesting place when it comes to relations between men and women in general. And so all of those are contributing factors to a decrease. And it would be foolish of me not to think that something like this exists. And I'm glad that it's weird that this is how the information had to come to me, at least. I'm sure that other people probably already know this, but to have the validation and knowing that there are actually religious movements or organizations that are committed to this kind of a goal, I guess. It's validating and alarming at the same time. I feel like that's just a constant state of being a Black person in America. It's just like, this is validating, but also alarming. Because this is the kind of thing where people would call you crazy, right? Like, if you said there are people who believe that they should have as many white babies as possible and will go through crazy lengths in order to do that, people call you crazy and say you're a conspiracy theorist. So it's great that there's actual evidence of an actual religious organization, movement, whatever, that is committed to doing something like this, so that you can say, hey, here's proof of it right here. But they were all disturbed by this, rightfully so. Not to say that, I don't know. I can't imagine what it would be like being kind of a pawn within a greater scheme of white supremacy. Even, I mean, not to say that they don't, they're white and they have blonde hair and blue eyes, so we can only weep too much. I mean, we can't weep too much, but it's like, they at least deserve the choice to be racist, right? Like, they at least deserve the choice to choose their ideological background, not to be some weird pawn in this man's scheme, if that is his goal and reasoning for doing this. They still don't know what his reasoning was for doing all of this. And so moving on, they finally got in touch with the Attorney General's office. They finally started discussing pressing charges. And evidently in the state of Indiana, this is not technically a crime, or at least it was not prior to 2018. So Tim Delaney, who was a former prosecutor for Marion County, Indiana, said, but at the end of the day, there's just no crime that touches this particular act. That's our problem. Then he said, I don't deny that there was a sexual violation, but legally it isn't a sexual violation. Quote, I feel like my mother was is a valid human emotional statement, which, hold on. But Dr. Klein committed is a legal assertion that was not true, and I wasn't going to put it on paper with my signature. It upset me the way that he was talking about this. Like, he was saying, like, well, they're emotional. They're just emotional, right? Like, there's no law technically that he's broken. He did not commit, which I understand that some part of this is just the fact that he's being documented for Netflix. And so I'm sure that he's just covering his legal bases, but it just seemed deeply insensitive. I think that if you asked any woman, like the glaringly obvious part of this to me was that when Indiana legislature was being created and when national legislature was being created, the rules defining what is and is not were defined by men. And so if you ask any woman, literally any woman, hey, if you want to be pregnant and you choose somebody to be a sperm donor for you and someone else uses their sperm instead, do you consider that to be? I think that the vast majority of women would say yes. But for whatever reason, in the state of Indiana, that did not count as, let's see. Jacoba said, so they were trying to figure out if this can't be a charge, can it be a battery charge? And so Jacoba says, and I said, what about battery? And he got rude with me. He said, I don't know how many times I'm gonna have to tell you this. I can't charge him with battery. It wasn't battery. And then she said, I looked at Tim Delaney and I said, so if I spit in your face right now, it's not battery. And he said, it is, because you'd be spitting on me. So evidently, I mean, I feel like we all understand this. Spitting on somebody is assault. If you spit on somebody, that's considered assault. You could, in theory, press charges. It'd be nitpicky, but you could. Under the current laws, or under the laws as they were in Indiana during this time, somebody inseminating you with their sperm against your will or without your knowledge is not or assault or battery, but spitting on somebody is. And she was pointing to the glaringly obvious contradiction there. Then Tim Delaney comes back in and says, Jacoba and a lot of the individuals touched by this were very emotional, and had a feeling that what I was there to do wasn't to apply the law to determine whether or not Dr. Klein had committed a crime. They thought I was there to deliver catharsis, and I wasn't. So he wasn't even, again, I feel like he's covering his legal basis, but he felt very insincere with this. This is a crime, right? Like, the fact that he's not like even if you can't prosecute him on said crime, it is a crime, right? And even just acknowledging that to the people who are pressing you on this, even just acknowledging that to Jacoba and her siblings would have been a better approach in my mind. It is a crime. Like, you saying, well, it's not a crime, so I don't know what you guys want me to do. And then trying to do some weird manipulation on them to change what they're saying like, well, y'all are just here for catharsis. Y'all are just trying to get revenge on this man. And I can't help you do that because it's not law or whatever. It just, all of it seemed really, I didn't like that guy. I'm sorry. I didn't like that guy. I'm sure Jacoba doesn't like that guy. There's no way that she likes that guy. So they brought in, let's see. They had an aside where Liz, one of the women who was the victims and gave birth to one of Klein's children, they had her quote and say, because she had been looking through the law herself, and evidently within Indiana, the only way that something can count as is if there is 1, force, and 2, non-consent, which I would argue the non-consent piece is there. the issue is the force piece. And I think that this also calls into question the fact that even if it did fall under the definition of there are abysmal numbers for conviction when it comes to, I believe that it's like 20% of all charges result in conviction, and barely any of them have any like real consequences even upon conviction. So and that's of the women who come forward. That's of the women who trust police officers and medical examiners to do their job in the first place. There's many women who don't even bother. So of the women who come forward and file an actual report, of the women who are able to get a prosecutor to actually press charges, only 20% of those cases are actually result in convictions. And I think that if it's not 20, it's slightly less. And so I don't know. I think that this is a conversation that needs to be linked with, I mean, they're legally not linking it with the definition of, but it is a form of, I think that most women would agree that this is a form of, and maybe if the conviction rates, I think that the conviction rates of cases are so incredibly low because men do not take cases seriously. More often than not, men are more concerned with not having charges pressed against them for quote unquote false charges than they are about actual that take place. So I think that this is an unfortunate side effect of the fact that the culture in general just does not give a about, which is unfortunate. And something that we need to be concerned with moving forward, again, like I said, because women's reproductive rights are under attack. So let's see. They brought in a law professor named Jody Madiera. I don't know how to say her name. From Indiana University. And she said, when you talk about, there is provision in Indiana law that says, quote, can include conduct which a victim does not know is sexual, but the perpetrator knows is sexual. And that, I think, is actually the closest charge. And then she goes on and says, but also I think we have to see Tim Delaney in the context in which this case was brought. And so when I interviewed Tim Delaney, he said that Indiana juries were not willing to buy, quote, by deception theories. The jury is going to say, quote, this woman consented to insemination. This woman wanted a baby. And the question is always out there, does this woman's desire for a child legitimate Donald Klein's deception? And unfortunately, that is a question that Tim Delaney had to weigh, would enter into the minds of jurors. And I think that this is a societal attitude towards in general. Society does not care about, as evidenced by the abysmal conviction rates. And so they can't all of a sudden start caring with this one case, right? I don't know. I'm just flabbergasted by it. There are holes. This is, again, this is another one of those instances to me where it's like validation, because people will call you crazy if you don't have like hard proof. This is hard proof of the holes that are in the legal system as a result of an overrepresentation of men making laws on behalf of all of us. Because like I said, you ask women about this situation, if you ask them hypothetically if this was, overwhelmingly women would say yes. This is not even a question. So it's crazy that it's not covered by law. And the reason why it's not, like, you can see all of the lack of representation all the way up to this moment, right? So that means that there's overwhelmingly male legislators that are defining what rape is for the rest of the population. There's overwhelmingly male lawyers who are choosing not to take this case to trial, right? Just all the way down the line, just failures which would lead up to this failure for these siblings. And I'm sure that they failed a lot of women along the way as well. So let's see. So they ended up being able to press charges against Dr. Klein, but not because he assaulted these women, allegedly. I guess I still have to say allegedly. They were bringing him up on charges of obstruction of justice because he lied to the Attorney General's office. So evidently they've been sending letters back and forth between the Attorney General's office and Dr. Klein. And at one point, Dr. Klein said in one of these documents, I did not use my own DNA. I did not use my own sperm sample on any of these kids, on any of these patients, which is an abject lie. That lie was considered to be obstruction of justice. And so they brought him up on charges for obstruction of justice, not on this sexual assault. I don't even know what you would classify it as other than and so he was forced to give at this point he's finally forced to give a DNA sample. It comes back that he is there is a 99.9997% chance that he is the father of all of these children. And so let's see. They take him to court. He ends up taking a plea deal. So he pleads guilty. He has 2 felony charges put on his record. They give him time served, saying that he has already been rehabilitated for all of this. And they charge him a $500 fine. At this point, I don't even know how many they're above 40 siblings at this point. I don't know what the count was at that point in the documentary. He was charged $500 for lying to the Attorney General's office, and then he went home. So Jacoba said, and I believe this to be true because I thought it was odd when he had access to somebody who could hack into Julie's computer and destroy all of the evidence that she had on her computer and in her drives or whatever. But during this case, or during the trial, Jacoba said that she felt as though the judge was overly lenient. She mentioned that the judge was during sentencing, the judge was like on the verge of tears, emotional about the fact that this man was in this position, I guess. And she said, the judge said, that's when, Jacoba says, that's when I, in my gut, felt like the state was corrupt. There were people corrupt and they were friends with him or something. And then they have the judge saying, please remember that whatever happens today during the sentencing, the people that love you are going to continue to love you. She says this to Dr. Klein. Then she says, this is a female judge. Then she says, with the limited resources that we have, overcrowding at the jail, and your lack of a criminal history and executed sentence is nothing the court is going to order. So they are saying we're not going to sentence you to jail. And so now they're still counting siblings at this point. So now we're at 53. A woman named Carrie. And this is where they start to get in. Like, remember how I said that this is so much worse than I thought it was going to be? Like, I thought it's already bad enough. It starts off, the premise is terrible on the face of it. Like, a man artificially inseminating all of these women with his own sperm or without their knowledge, without their consent. Then we get the white supremacist conspiracy theory bit. And then now we're talking about health problems, right? So Carrie said that her parents went out of their way to try and find a healthy sperm donor. I think that most people if you're going to go through the trouble of choosing somebody to be the father of a child, you're going to try and pick the healthiest person that you can find, of course. And so a lot of people obviously go out of their way. They're like, we don't want any genetic issues. We don't want people with predispositions to, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, those kinds of things. but that all of the siblings had this many of the siblings had this autoimmune disorder that they couldn't explain. Some of them described it as like a blood clotting. They had blood clotting. And with Carrie, I believe that she had a miscarriage that resulted from this blood clotting, and they couldn't figure out what was causing all of this. And it's some genetic predisposition that many of them have. So then they start going through all of the siblings that we know thus far. And they're saying, yeah, I've had to go in and out of the hospital. I've had all of these surgeries. I've had to have colonoscopy, endoscopy, all of these different surgeries and treatments for this autoimmune disease. And they mention that about 30%, I believe that's what they said, is about 30% of sperm donors don't even make it past the initial questionnaire, the form, because they have a family history of whatever undesirable trait that they don't want to pass on, that people don't want, a predisposition to, like I said, like cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, those kinds of things. And so they get to the last one that they show us, number 61, and it's Allison Kramer. Come to find out, this was the craziest reveal the craziest reveal. So they've been discussing this whole situation. They've had his colleagues come in and they interviewed them as part of this documentary. And so we've been listening to some of his colleagues. There's two doctors who were doing their interview together. I guess it's kind of insinuated that they're married, a couple. They were just labeled as his colleagues throughout the entire documentary. Get to the end, and Allison Kramer is the last one that they are interviewing. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, again, just like all of the other ones. And she reveals the fact that her mother used IVF, used Dr. Klein's services in order to have her and her twin sister. And it's revealed that this doctor that they've been interviewing this entire time, this woman, is their mother. So a colleague who trusted her friend, in order to do this in vitro fertilization treatment, in order to have siblings, and this entire time, or to have children, to have twins. And this entire time, they believed that the man that was sitting next to her was this woman's father, and that the Allison believed that this was her father too. Come to find out that he's not. And the only reason that they I guess any red flags were raised is because she suffers from, again, this autoimmune disorder, and she has passed it on to her kids. She has a couple of kids, and they also suffer from the same autoimmune disorder. And she said that not only was Dr. Klein her mother's doctor, but he was also her doctor, knowing full well that that was technically her biological father doing these treatments on her, knowing full well that he fathered these twins to his colleague. I just deranged. That man, there's something, he's a sociopath. There's no way. So she's the one I mentioned that was shaking. She was shaking when they were interviewing her, when they got to this part. She was shaking, recounting all of this, saying like, if I had known, I would have never wanted him to touch me in that way or be anywhere near me in that way. Because obviously if he's doing fertility treatments, he's also like an OBGYN. He's like, what I'm saying, intimately involved with her privates. Just a weird, deranged man, bruh. Just gross. So, they show a few slides at the end of the documentary that discuss, it says, in 2018, the mothers and siblings successfully passed legislation in Indiana making illicit donor inseminations illegal. So it now is illegal to do what Dr. Klein did in Indiana. But then they go on and say there is currently no federal law, which means federally speaking, and depending on which state you live in, there's no law covering this. Largely because the definition of has been defined by men. Now, I'm not saying that men do not experience. Of course they do. In fact, men have a higher likelihood of being themselves than being falsely accused of. That statistic came out some years ago. But there's no law covering this. There's holes in the legal system for people to just waltz through, because there's holes in the perspectives of the legislators, of the prosecutors, of the attorney generals, of the senators, like all of this, you know what I'm saying? Of the governors. It's glaring, like gigantic holes within the legal system where violence can be enacted, and it's not, the victims are not protected because there's no legislation around this. And so they go on and say, thanks to at-home DNA testing, 44 additional doctors have been found to have used their own sperm to inseminate fertility patients. And then they said, as of this production, there are currently 94 Klein siblings and counting. He artificially inseminated 94 women with his own sperm and passed along a predisposition to an autoimmune diseases. A lot of it's just cruel. You know what I'm saying? Just cruelty. No regard for the well-being of the kids. I'm sure that he was of the mindset that this would never come forward. Like he would never be found out. I'm sure that that's what he was thinking, which is odd. Like the entire time that I was watching this, I was like, you work as an IVF doctor. Like you're on the cutting edge of IVF, which means that you have some knowledge of DNA and the way that it's being used within medical sciences now. Seems that he would have been able to predict the fact that eventually DNA testing would be available to the public on a commercial basis. Seems that he would have been able to see that. Now, he was doing all of this in the late 70s, early 80s. They weren't even technically using DNA within crime scene investigation yet. But like the arrogance, they described him as being a very arrogant man. I don't know, it's just disturbing. It's just gross. Like, yeah. So I think that this seems pertinent and relevant now, because I know that, like I said, you say certain things without concrete evidence and people call you a conspiracy theorist. Maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist. I don't know. But to me, it seems relevant to right now because like I said, women's reproductive rights are under attack. I have to believe that there's an agenda behind that, right? What is the agenda? I think that a lot of people have a lot of theories as to why people are covering up a lot of stuff with religious rhetoric, right? Saying, well, it's just not the biblical way. It's just not Jesus's way, that kind of a thing. But knowing that there are religious organizations out there with the aim of having as many children born as possible, particularly white children, I have to believe that has something to do with it. And taking it out of the context of the Klein children, they mentioned that within that tangent, they were talking about how they deliberately set up those kids to aim for positions within politics. We never really got a resolution on whether or not the judge was corrupt in this case, whether or not the attorney general's office was corrupt in this case. Jacoba had a sixth sense saying that she felt as though these people were in cahoots. We never really got a resolution on that. But if this is an ideology that exists, I have to imagine that there are people who are in places of power that were put there specifically with these kind of ideologies in mind, that there are people out there who are deliberately going out of their way to inseminate and fertilize as many children as many women as possible, to have as many children as possible, and directing those children directly towards positions of power political power, legal power, whatever. And even if that's not necessarily what Dr. Klein was doing, I feel like that's something that we need to be concerned with. Perhaps that's the reason why there's so many glaring holes within legislation around and sexual assault. But again, that's speculative, and in the realm of conspiracy theory, I'll you know what I'm saying? I'm willing to say that. I'm not afraid of being a conspiracy theorist. But I think that that's relevant considering where we're headed. If abortion rights are restricted, or done away with altogether, if access to contraceptives are restricted and done away with altogether, if, you know what I'm saying, access to all of these fertility treatment or I guess access to contraceptives, access to abortion, access to all of these different barriers to having a child at an inopportune time, if those are all removed, and it's coupled with the insanely weak legislation around what is, the definitions of what are, that just seems like a recipe for disaster to me. I don't know, man. It just seems bad. So that was a weird evening that I had watching that. Just crazy. I'll leave that there. If you've made it this far through the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you could like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, comment up under the video, your thoughts on this weird documentary. And let's see, I'm going to be reviewing Betty on Friday, like I said, going over the Rachel Vinberg case, sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations on Friday. And until I see you next time, be good.